yesterday and this morning. So is known as magnetic stimulation, so TMS. Whereas the stuff that we cover, so TMS it covers a whole range of stuff. So there's loads of different ones. There's single pulse. So when I was administering it on my head and getting a motor evoked potential, that was just single pulse. You can also do paired pulse, which is where you've got two single pulses firing in very, very short intervals. Or there's also repetitive stimulation, which is the type of stimulation you're going to be doing, which is numerous pulses fired within very, very close succession of each other. So all of those procedures fall under the umbrella of TMS, whereas the DC stimulator here, which can stimulate instead of using magnetic energy, it uses electrical current to stimulate the head instead. So there's tDCS, which is transcranial direct current stimulation. There's tACS. There's tRNS, which is random noise stimulation. Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you. So yeah, there's tACS, tDCS, and tRNS. So a tDCS waveform is just like you get a ramp up at the start, and then you've got your stimulation, which is very current. The stimulation wave just looks like that, and then you've got your ramp down at the end. Your tACS is it stimulates both ways. So tDCS is to alter the membrane of the kind of, I'm trying to put this in language that is easy to understand. It changes the membrane of the neuron, making a cell more or less likely to fire. So with TMS, all we do is we activate the neuron and say, okay, you're good to fire. With tDCS, we can change the threshold of where that neuron is likely to fire. So if, for example, we have, let's say we've got a subject who has ADHD and they're very cortically excited. So if we were to administer TMS in an ADHD patient, we wouldn't need a very high number to get them to get a reaction out of them. So what we can do and it's been proved in literature as well, that in subjects who are very cortically excited, we can administer tDCS and we can lower that membrane and just kind of cortically calm them down a little bit. It then means should we fire TMS again, we wouldn't have to have such a low number. So tACS, which is where the wave kind of goes up and down, and there's two types. You can get sinus, or you can get sinus HW. So the sinus HW is just a half wave. So it's either one way or the other. Or the tACS, the sinus, which is the full wave. So you see a tACS waveform doing this. So what that lets us do, that would, instead of just kind of the membrane on a cellular level, which you would do with tDCS, tACS, we can change the kind of activity of the brain on a whole level rather than just a membrane level, which would then we can kind of it helps with like depression protocols and stuff like that are often done with tACS. The other one we can do with the stimulator here that we've got is random noise stimulation. Now, when TDS looks like this and tACS looks like this, a random noise stimulation, what we do is we set our upper limit and we set our lower limit of stimulation, and the stimulator will stimulate at random frequencies within those two parameters. So what that means is, as opposed to tDCS, which just has, which is kind of the level of tDCS is determined by that signal current, because you can't stimulate someone at a very strong current. So because the current is all traveling in one direction, that current is very dense. But with random noise, because you're setting those parameters, the current isn't quite as dense. So that means you can change those kind of the kind of frequencies that you're stimulating at. So there's a wider range basically of stimulation that you can do. It does mean, however, that it's not quite as accurate because with it being random, you can't then go back into the stimulation and you can't see exactly where those frequencies were occurring. So when you look at a TRNS trace, it just looks like kind of random, white noise really. So it looks like EMG noise, for example. It's kind of a mess. You can't really tell anything from it. So in a research environment, there's not as much research is undertaken using TRNS, random noise stimulation. A lot of the research with tDCS that's where a lot of the research is done with tDCS, because we know kind of, it's fairly safe to assume that we know what it does, so we can set our parameters. In terms of its application within the human brain, research has found that I've got a list that I'll be able to reel off to you. That tDCS has been found to have an advantage in. So it's anything from depression protocols, muscular pain in the body, migraine, epilepsy, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, tinnitus, feelings of neglect, rehabilitation. So I was talking earlier about stroke patients, if they're having trouble speaking, so which is aphasia, or if they're having trouble with their kind of neuron pathways, their motor pathways, tDCS can help to kind of re-establish those. Traumatic brain injury, OCD, it can help people get over compulsive disorders. Attention, like I was talking about earlier, attention disorders, you can help to change the cortical level with those. People's vigilance, so how switched on people are and how attentive they are. It can be used to accelerate learning. So a good thing you can do is you can give a subject a functional task. So you can have them learn a brand new task. You can then apply tDCS, and it'll help them. It helps to kind of collaborate that memory a bit better, consolidate memory consolidation. It's been found to help with. So stuff like reading. So reading is always a kind of a new task for people. Maths. So we can help with maths as well. It's helped people establish memories a bit better. So we can use tDCS while people sleep. So in REM sleep, it's been found to help people consolidate memories a bit better. Feelings of compassion, impulsivity. So we can change impulsivity one way or the other. So we can make people. So it's used a lot in kind of marketing. So we can make people more likely to kind of shop and say, yeah, I'll go ahead and buy that. Compassion, feelings of jealousy, IQ, but the jury's still out on whether we can actually make people cleverer. Obviously, that's fairly outstanding claims, really. Otherwise, we'd all be doing tDCS. And also kind of feelings of kind of prejudice as well. So really, tDCS is really a neuromodulator. So it acts much like a drug. We can administer tDCS and we're able to bias activity on the type of on the current wavelength that we give them, and kind of processing within neural networks. It's inexpensive, especially compared to the likes of TMS, so it means it's much more accessible. So you get people, now this isn't certainly not recommended, but you get people kind of making their own tDCS equipment. So I mean the technology behind it isn't as sophisticated as we've got with TMS, which also means it's a lot more cost effective. With tDCS, it's shammable, which is one of its really it's one of its good features. When we administer TMS, it's quite apparent if the customer is having, is being stimulated. Whereas with tDCS, you can have it in such a way that the subject doesn't know if they're receiving stimulation or not. So it then means we can find out if a task is being made easier because of tDCS or because it isn't because of tDCS. It's relatively easy to administer. It's not like, because it isn't as focal, so because we've got our, let me get some electrodes. Some sponges. Okay. So when we're talking about TMS, the hotspot of the coil is very, very small. So the stimulation, when we administer stimulation to someone, we found this morning it's quite hard to get the coil without using imaging software. It's quite hard to get the coil in exactly the right place. It's because the hotspot of the coil is so very small. When we're doing tDCS, we've got nice large electrodes, so it's much easier to administer because you can just put the electrode on the area that you're trying to stimulate, and obviously your electrode out where you want the kind of current passing through that structure of the brain there. Which means, but that does mean that it's not as focal. So if you're looking for very kind of focused stimulation, you want to use tDCS, but TMS. But tDCS does allow you to stimulate much deeper. So TMS, we're only stimulating probably 20 to 25 mil into the cortex, whereas tDCS, obviously, because we're stimulating through, it's much deeper stimulation. We've got there then the sponges as well. So there is a trend at the moment towards using electrode gel rather than the sponges, because with the gel, it's much easier to control exactly kind of what's going through. Whereas with the sponge, when you're using a saline solution, the salinity of the solution can change if you're not using it from the same place all the time. It also means that, so that depending on how wet a sponge is, depends on the impedance level. So if you've got a sponge that's a bit dry, obviously your impedance level is very low, and you run the risk of causing skin burns on someone. But when the sponge is too wet, you then mean the saline solution can then drip, and it then means you can't control exactly that stimulation area, because you could, if I've got the sponge on there and we've got a water drip coming down my forehead there, the current is going to follow the water drip because it's easier to conduct. So that it then means that our area of stimulation has moved from there, and it's now kind of following its way down my forehead, which is why at the moment there is a trend for the electrode gel, because it doesn't drip, so it's easier to control. It's quite well tolerated, so the side effects of tDCS are not the same as we're going to get in TMS. So we saw in when I gave the talk about the safety to do with TMS, whilst it is rare, it is possible to bring on seizures, and headaches happen quite a lot with, so even yesterday I gave myself a bit of a headache when we were just administering TMS to my head. Whereas as long as the currents aren't particularly strong in tDCS, which they're not, it's quite well received. All the subject feels is kind of a kind of prickly tingling almost on the scalp. There's three, tDCS is kind of split into 3 levels of stimulation. So there's level A, which is definitely effective or ineffective. So we know when we're stimulating at level A, we know absolutely we're getting this, or we're absolutely not getting this. Now, there's no research at the moment that can absolutely confirm that it works one way or the other. A lot of the research has been done is classed as level B, which is, I love the way this is worded, it's probably effective or it's probably ineffective. So there's certainly a trend in research where we can say, yeah, this looks like it's working, or yeah, we don't think this is working. But again, it's not, we can't say one way or the other for sure. And then there's level C, level B, stuff like depression and chronic pain has been classed as level B studies. So we can probably see that we're treating depression and chronic pain when I'm administering tDCS. And then level C, we've got possibly effective or possibly ineffective. So again, that stroke rehabilitation, so motor and speech aphasia have been classed as level C. So it looks as though the research is there, but again, it's that step underneath the depression one because we're not seeing enough trends yet. And it's been, whilst TMS is quite new, there's been a resurgence in tDCS. tDCS was around in the 1800s, so the tDCS is really old as a way of stimulating the brain. But in the last 20 years, it's really kind of been kick-started again. There was 2 scientists in Germany that decided to kind of, we're gonna take this on again and see if we can get it to go. So when we talk about tRNS, alterations within, like I say with tRNS, because it's random noise, we can't say for sure that we know exactly what's going on in there. We can say that there's trends, we're seeing differences, so they're assumed to be, those trends that we see are assumed to be repeated subthreshold, the cause of subthreshold repeated stimulations. In the same manner, like I said earlier, the same manner as tDCS, random noise stimulation changes the cortical excitability by means of mechanisms of membrane polarization, so essentially the same way tDCS works. But like I said, we're not then limited by that strength density. There's few studies have evaluated the modulation effects of tRNS, and they've shown to induce substantial behavioural modifications. So there's a paper in 2008 found that they improve reaction times during a repeated test. But on the flip side of that, that was also part of the kind of the questioning behind that was, is that not a learning task? So when people are seeing a task happening, are they not then learning, therefore reducing their reaction time? And it's also been found to improve performance in a visual perception learning task. So again, that kind of learning memory, and that was a paper in 2011. So what I can do is I can go over kind of the software on the stimulator and how you'd set the stimulator up to kind of run through your stimulation. But before I do that as well, I can talk about kind of some safety implications to bear in mind when you're applying tDCS. So electrode prep is the scalp prep is the first thing you want to do. So when we're doing EEG, sometimes you want to scratch the scalp a little bit to get a nice clean, to get very low impedance and get a nice clean trace. What you absolutely do not want to do when you're administering any kind of electrical stimulation is scratch the scalp, because electrical current will always follow the path of least resistance. So you want to make sure on your subject that there's no kind of cuts or scratches or anything on their scalp, because what will happen there is that we think we're stimulating over the entire electrode surface there. What we're actually doing is sending all that stimulation through that small cut in the head, which can then, like I say, bring on those kind of lesions and skin burns there. So it's really, really important that you check that there's no broken skin or anything like that. It is good as well because you want really low impedance when you're using TES. So it is good to just get an alcohol wipe and just clean the surface of the skin. Make sure you don't abrade it at all, but just clean the surface of the skin. It's going to take off it's going to remove any of those dead skin artifacts that you might get. Also, the amount of hair underneath an electrode will affect your current. So on subjects like myself, their hair has vacated their head, it's quite easy to get low impedance because there's no hair in the way. When we've got subjects with a full head of hair and female subjects, what you want to try and do is when you're setting up your stimulation, you want to just try and move as much of that part of the hair as much as you can do at the site of stimulation, because it then means that there's less obstruction in the way. There's less underneath the electrode. Obviously, the gel will help. The gel and the sponges, they will help to let the current pass through there. So I've talked about kind of the electrode paste or gel and saline solution. It's really important that you don't use water, because if you would just use kind of distilled or tap water, you don't know kind of exactly what's in there. So there could be something in there that allows current to pass through a little bit easier. With saline solution, again, providing you're using the same salinity, we know for sure exactly kind of what's in that water there. I talked earlier about focality of stimulation, so how kind of focal it is. Now, whilst it's known that tDCS isn't focal, there is a way to make it slightly more focal. So what we can do is we can use slightly smaller electrodes, but we then need to make sure that as we use smaller electrodes, we then need to monitor our current, because if we were to leave the current the same and make these electrodes a bit smaller, we're then making our surface area smaller, therefore increasing our current density. So as you bring there's plenty of research available online about kind of current density and where you need to stimulate at. But as you bring the size of your electrode down, it is important to monitor that current as well and make sure that's coming down on the same level. Smaller electrodes, like I say, are more focal, but what we can do is we can also use, it's known as, there's a company called Sideeffects in America have trademarked this name, but you can use something called HDtDCS, which is 4 anodes in and then 1 cathode. So for example, if we were to stimulate something over the frontal cortex, we could have 4 small electrodes kind of in a square on the frontal cortex, and then we'd have another small electrode out. So then we're sending a lot more current in, and it's because the electrodes are spread, they're not quite as dense, but as we're coming out, we're then concentrating all of that stimulation on one area. The problem is with that though, is because we can't monitor the resistance within each electrode, so it is important for us, it's better if we can daisy chain, because we're only getting 2 milliamps out of this. we don't know exactly, if we're using 4 electrodes, we don't know how they're being split when they're traveling down the electrodes. So a good thing to do is to kind of daisy chain multiple stimulators together, so then we're still getting the same amount of stimulation, which is traveling down the same amount of, so it's as if we're just using this with 2 electrodes. If we've got another one there, what we'd do is connect the 2 of them together, and then we've got 2 providing stimulation down 4 electrodes, which is one way around it. It's one way around that kind of problem of not knowing exactly what's going on. To do it with 1 stimulator, you just need, it's essentially a splitter box, which it's an accessory that we are able to provide. So tDCS, I mentioned earlier about kind of depression protocols and stuff as well. So the repetitive transcranial stimulator there, you may ask why then would you use tDCS when you've got a machine here that can kind of give the subject the same protocol? Well, like I've touched on, electronic stimulation or electric stimulation allows for much deeper stimulation. So we're not just stimulating the cortex, we're stimulating deeper brain structures over a much larger area. So we don't have the same focality and for a much longer period of time. So that can bring on longer lasting effects. So it then means we wouldn't need to administer stimulation as many times as we would do with the magnetic stimulation there. So whilst I kind of ramble on about kind of tDCS and electronic stimulation, what we do offer workshops in both TMS and TES, and they're delivered by researchers, so people with proper neuroscience backgrounds as opposed to someone with more of the product-based background. So if there's still kind of outlying questions on there and you feel like it might be a beneficial thing to do, I'll be able to pass on any details that anyone might want. Okay, so some of the kind of side effects that people might feel when, I'm not going to do any stimulation today because it's not like the TMS where I kind of, it's very fast. So I won't be stimulating anyone with this today. But some of the side effects that your subject might feel whilst undertaking tDCS is skin irritation, so that kind of prickly, heating, it almost feels like a burning sensation, but it isn't. There's that sensation there. There's kind of itching, it's just that irritable kind of itching feeling. Again, headache, because you're bringing in, and the straps that we use to hold those on can apply pressure. Obviously, any pressure on the head, it can induce headaches. Seizures haven't been found to be caused in electronic stimulation to the extent that they have in magnetic stimulation, but you do get kind of these hot spots where the electrodes have been. You do find that sometimes it can leave red skin underneath. Again, that's just because it's had electrical stimulation passing through it. So I don't know, how much have we done with the stimulator already? Has any research been done with it? Anything like that, do you know? So do we have any researchers that know how to use the stimulator? Or is it worth going that through as well?
Try to stimulate frontal regions and
Okay.
see how it influences attentions.
Okay, so to start your stimulation there, what you can do is, I'll turn it off to begin with. So you've got your power button on the top there. So we turn it on, and we get that nice beep, and we're presented with, it's going to be quite hard to see, we're presented with our first screen there, which tells us the serial number and the amount of battery we've got left as well. If the battery is below a certain point, I think it's 50%, the stimulator won't let you stimulate because it does then run the risk of running out of battery kind of mid-stimulation. Now, you don't want to run out of battery mid-stimulation, because with this, if you were to cut off stimulation just like that, it causes quite an unpleasant kind of feeling in the head. So this has something called safe stop built into it. So what safe stop does is safe stop reduces your amplitude by 1 milliamp for every second. So it then means it's kind of a slow ramp down instead of it kind of coming to an end and then causing that not very nice feeling on the head. So then you're at your home screen there. Now the top thing is we're given our parameter, so we can change that underneath. And it's quite an old kind of setup there, but it's really intuitive to use. So you've got whether you go up or down on this one, so we can move our cursor up or down with these two buttons, and then these ones are essentially like a yes or a no, or a proceed or a back, and we just navigate using those 4 buttons. So the top line, we can then choose our parameter. So if we scroll down, we're on tDCS there. So to change that, we press these 2 buttons there, and we can have pulse mode, and then we've got our half wave there, our sinus wave, which is tACS. And as we go through, we've got our noise stimulation there as well. As we go down again, we can then choose the current, or we can choose, in noise stimulation, we can choose the offset between those 2 currents, so setting those parameters. We can select the duration of stimulation, so how long we want that stimulation to last for. Again, in terms of duration of stimulation, that's not for me to tell you what you do need to do. It depends on the type of testing you want to be doing. Again, if you're replicating research, or if you're doing kind of empirical, brand new research, you'd then be choosing the duration of stimulation. The same is to be said for electrode placement. You know, I'm not here to say, oh, if you want to stimulate this, put your electrode here and your electrode here. Electrode placement, again, is down to previous research, or it's down to kind of, you know, literature, pertinent literature reviews and stuff like that. So underneath where, so say for example, we're setting our duration, we can then go down again, and we can change in steps of 5. Or we can go back up in steps of 5 seconds. So say for example, we'll go back. Bear with me. We can set tDCS. We can then set our current at 500 microamps. The duration, at the moment, we're set to 180 seconds. And then our fade in. So what this does, I mentioned earlier about kind of just turning the stimulator on and turning it off again. Now, you don't want to do that because that just puts an electrical current on the head. So the fade in is like a slow ramp of current. So it'll build current up nice and slowly until you reach your stimulation level. You then have the length of stimulation there, which will be 30. In this case, we've got 180 seconds. And then at the end, you've got your ramp down again, which slowly takes away that stimulation, those sensations there. So we can set that. And then after that, we've got our fade out as well. So that essentially is how to set your parameters. And then at the top there, we can say, we can go into different menus there. So we're in stimulation, yes or no. Now, it's not going to let me do anything because I've not got any electrodes plugged in or anything like that. So if I was just to hit yes there, it'd say, oh, the impedance level is miles off. It's because there's nothing plugged in. So yeah, impedance is way above the limit. That's because it's not detecting any electrodes and it's not detecting any kind of, any scalp prep or anything like that. So we can close that. If you click close, it just says stimulation cancel. So you can't actually turn the stimulator on without having done all of the preparation first. And then if we go back, you can schedule a time too. So the nice thing is with this is that you can leave the stimulator and you can leave a subject kind of plugged into the stimulator, and you can have the stimulator turn on at a certain time, and it'll then just initiate that stimulation there, which is nice. So it means that the researcher kind of can let the subject do their own parameters. So if, for example, you had a depression protocol, which meant the subject would be taking the stimulator home with them, as long as the subject is ready and set up and they've got their electrodes prepared, the stimulation could just start, and then it means that we could use it for home use and stuff like that, which is much more accessible than having something like that in your living room, which you can't really do. I mean, you saw me try to do it earlier. You know, you can't really do it accurately on yourself, whereas this is much easier to do that. You can also set a remote there, so you can have something else. So I was talking earlier to someone who is looking to build a protocol in their own software, and then send a signal from that software into the stimulator to say, okay, I want you to fire. So we can use that. Again, I could be sat here with the stimulator there, and then applying stimulation to one of you. It then means you're not able to see any levels, so you wouldn't be able to tell if you're feeling any kind of strong current or weak current. There is also, let's see if it's installed on this one. Trigger input disabled. Okay, so if we go down. So it would appear study mode hasn't been put on there, which is a shame. Okay, so in terms of, I was speaking earlier about shamming and applying sham stimulation. Now, on the system that the university's purchased, the sham stimulation hasn't been set up. So it's not an extra that has been bought on this one. So on this one, it is always going to be stimulating the patient there. A lot of tDCS kind of relies on kind of questions from the researchers. So within kind of what you can use it for. So is there anything that I'm not covering that you want to know specifically about the tDCS machine? So is there any research that you're currently doing which is going to use the tDCS machine, or anything I can answer questions on in there, instead of me kind of just running through what all the menus mean? It would probably be better if there's direct questions kind of regarding the stimulator that we can answer.
So could you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So this is on here, these aren't for anode and cathode. There you've got remote in. So if you're triggering externally, so if you have, we're talking about the laptop, you can write into your protocol to say that, okay, I want the stimulation to start now. You've also got trigger out as well. So you can have the stimulator trigger something else. Be it if you're doing EEG at the same time, for example, you can have the stimulator tell the EEG when to start recording. So it then means you're not left with a load of EEG data, which has no stimulation underneath it. But obviously, within EEG, you would be able to see that stimulation waveform kind of sat within that data there. Your other question about electric moving in circles, the reason for having electrode in and electrode out, so we'd have the current going into the head, and then the current going out of the head there. So you are then completing the circuit. So there is a gap. I mean, we can't say exactly how much current is being lost within the brain, but your subject is kind of completing the gap in the circuit there by having the current pass
So it's
from one side to the other.
It's like this, or it's like this?
It travels that way.
It travels this way.
Yes. So it doesn't kind of spiral through the brain.
Okay.
It travels in a straight line.
Okay.
I say straight. I think it travels from one electrode to the other, not necessarily in a direct line. But yeah, I hope that answers those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Providing it's within what the stimulator can apply, so then yes, you can set your parameters in external software, which is probably easier to do. Instead of setting your parameters just using 4 buttons, you could set your exact parameters in your software and then build your triggers into there as well. And providing they're within what the stimulator can actually emit. Say that again? Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, but in terms of building those kind of protocols, that is way beyond my. That's what you guys are for. That's why you're researchers. That's way beyond my kind of knowledge level there. So yeah, but yeah, you can trigger externally and set parameters in software. Yeah.
No pre-existing protocol from the company. We have to write ourselves.
Yeah. So it's not something that there isn't kind of a given. It depends on, because you could be writing a protocol for anything. So it depends on kind of where your research is based, really, the area of that research.
So if we have a research on protocol.
That's it. Yeah. So if the literature's already there,
Yeah.
then it'll probably say within the literature as well what they were stimulating with. But yeah, if there's something that you're not clued up on, you could then send us that protocol. Send us like an outline of the protocol to say what you're stimulating and what you're stimulating at. So in terms of voltage, and we'll be able to say if the stimulator can do it or not. Yeah.
Okay.
Crikey. Okay. Right. This is news to me. I didn't even know you had one of those. That there is acquisition software.
Yeah.
Right, even this, so this is, I'm not particularly clued up on this either. This is more to do with our software side of stuff. Oh, here we go. More surprises. So the CED, the 1401, it's a data acquisition box, basically. So everything in this is everything you do with, it wouldn't be used with tDCS, it'd be used with the TMS machine. So you can then program kind of interstimulus intervals, and you can record, you can have the EMG recording into this as well. So what this does is kind of capture all of your stimulation parameters and stores them all kind of within the box there. Yeah, but it's not a particular piece of hardware that I'm that familiar with. So I'm more down kind of the stimulation route. So if you're after kind of training on how to use this, what would probably be better to do is if we were to do a Skype session with a colleague of mine, so we can arrange that, and then that's probably the best way around this. Instead of me trying to kind of stumble through this, I think it'd be better if we were to arrange a Skype session and run through it that way.
What are the differences?
To do it simultaneously, so you can do cognitive task first, and you can then stimulate and then redo a cognitive task. So that there, you can see if the stimulator is saying yes, it's making a difference, or no, it's making a difference. If you were to do a cognitive task whilst you're doing it, that there is more kind of consolidating that information. So I was saying earlier, there's a sportsman in America who's using tDCS, and what he's doing is he's using it whilst he's doing an activity, so not whilst he's out. So he's a cyclist, and he's got a static bike in his home, and he's using tDCS to basically, he's saying that he can make himself, I was talking about fatigue, so tDCS can be used to delay the onset of fatigue. Again, this is one of those things where it's a class 2, so it possibly does or it possibly doesn't. With tDCS, we can't say for sure one way or the other yet. But whilst you're doing a cognitive task, it kind of makes that processing happen whilst you're doing a task. So that consolidation of memory and working memory can be done whilst you stimulate, as opposed to doing a task and then stimulating and then doing a task to see the effect that had on it at the time.
Completely another one.
You'd be able to buy an EEG device on its own. Yeah, so we do something do something called TrueScan, which is made by the same company, but it's just an EEG device as opposed to the EMG device.
So you have to buy a complete new EEG device to make it
So did you say there's already an EEG device available to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you'd be able to, I'm fairly certain, do you know what it is?
Dr. Yu is
It's all right. I get this a lot. Is it like a?
Nest stations.
Do you know where?
The software is Nest Station.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with those. Are they? Do you know if the optodes are quite low profile? Because if the problem is sometimes with EEG and TMS at the same time, if you've got quite a thick, let's say we've got quite a thick electrode there, it means that the coil is sitting further away from the scalp. So because the depth of the stimulation on TMS is not very deep, when you sit the coil on top of an electrode, the pulse doesn't travel quite as far. So providing your electrodes with your EEG are nice and kind of low profile, you can still get the coil to sit reasonably close to the scalp. And there's no issue with firing, because EEG is electric and EMG is magnetic, there's no issue with firing a magnetic pulse through. All you'll see in your EEG trace is that there's a big TMS artifact there, which can be removed afterwards. You can filter that out when you're kind of reviewing your data there. So that's correct. Yeah. So we are seeing that. So we are seeing that in sport. So especially in sport, there's this kind of big doping scandal with people taking drugs and it going undetected. And this is brand new research. So this is happening right now, this research. But basically, instead of just taking drugs to dope, there is this theory now that brain doping is happening, where people are stimulating the brain to reduce that kind of time or increase that time to fatigue. So your athletes can work harder. There's nothing published on that, because like I said, the research is brand new. But it's looking as though that could be the next big scandal, if you will, is that people are doing this brain doping. Yeah. I used to know who was doing the research, but that name escapes me at the moment. Let's have a look if I can see if I can find it on here.
Because because this is portable, so actually people can use by themselves.
That's the best thing about, yeah, that's the best. It's one of the key things about tDCS is that it's much more, it's much more accessible. So you can set up and you can do it in your own home. You can move it around your lab.
Before the yes, before the DPC is there.
Yeah, so I don't have the name of who's doing the research, unfortunately, but yeah, it is research that's happening in.
It really knows the exact place.
Yeah. So it's another kind of idea of what tDCS can be used for. So it's another application of it. Yeah. Any other questions? Any questions regarding anything we've covered that are still kind of outlying? We'll try to answer anything to the best of my ability.
Another question is that because the device is new to us,
Yeah.
And although you have given us excellent technical support,
I don't know if it's excellent, but
let me say something.
I think it depends on your areas of research. So if you're finding papers that you think are quite interesting, you probably would, obviously the names of the researchers are always at the top of the papers. So you'd probably be able to contact them and say, I'm doing research in a similar area to you. Kind of, could we discuss protocols and stuff like that? So I don't think we'd be used as, you wouldn't have to use this company as a go-between, because we deal more with the product side of stuff, as opposed to, because we don't do our own research as a company. It could be better to get in touch with the researchers directly there. Yeah, but we do try and keep our finger on the pulse with new research. So if we're finding, a group of researchers are doing research in a certain area that is quite interesting, for example, this brain doping, we will kind of try and replicate the studies, but it's in our own office. It's not like a electronic stimulation lab or anything. So. Sorted. Cool. So I think that essentially wraps up everything that we've got. Yeah, I'm free to kind of, whilst I help tidy up and everything, I'm free. If there's anything you want to chat about in person, just give me a shout. And as well, I think people have got my email address. So if there's anything that, if you go away and have a bit of a think, if there's any questions you want to kind of email me, I'm more than happy to answer them as well. In terms of ongoing technical support as well, if there's anything that kind of comes up in your research where you say, oh, well, Mark didn't cover this in his installation and his kind of fairly basic workshops, we'll be able to help with those as well. One thing I did mention earlier as well is that if there's kind of particular techniques that you're looking for, like I say, we Rogue Resolutions has a side arm called Brainbox Initiative, who do run dedicated workshops by people in research. So if you'd be interested in stuff like that as well, it could be worth pursuing that. So yeah, cool.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Cheers.